Thank you very much, Glenn. It's really a pleasure to be here. I respect the work that Jamestown does. I particularly respect their relentlessness with which that they take on the task. I often told my colleagues at the State Department, I'll have a moment about the State Department and the differences with the Pentagon, that how important it is for colleagues in the diplomatic community to understand a little bit more about security trends, because it's just really impossible to do your business in the diplomatic arena without really understanding the underlying security trends and transformations that are taking place in the Asia-Pacific region. So I'm very grateful for what Jamestown does. I will tell you, I'm not sure I have much to add to this crowd. I don't think I bring any longer the sort of number crunching or analytic skills with respect to what's going on in the PLA. I don't think I have a particular understanding about technological innovations that are driving particular trends in terms of military transformations. And so what I think I can do for you is give you a sense of how these developments that are basically, I think, churning at a degree of intensity that we've not seen in the past, how that is driving diplomacy, and what I would recommend that the United States do to think about this on the way forward, right? How do we basically fashion a strategy for confronting what I would argue is going to be the lion's share of the history of the 21st century is going to be written in the Asia-Pacific region. But you would not know that from even a cursory review of American foreign policy in the current arena. And so one of our challenges is to make clear to friends and others how important it is for the United States to find the wit and wisdom to engage in a region that's going to be unbelievably dynamic for the United States, both in terms of our prosperity but our security going forward. So I would say I appreciated the introduction. I have served at the White House, Treasury, but my two most long-serving periods, I worked at the Pentagon and I worked at the State Department. No two places could be more different. But I will say, I don't know if I'd ever serve any other place in the State Department subsequently. I've never enjoyed working with a group of people. I've never worked with more patriotic people and more committed people than I did at the State Department. And what's interesting about it, I mean, if you compare one institution essentially on steroids and another, the State Department, essentially on life support, and what that's like with respect to budgets and how you have to think about doing your business. And I always thought when I was at the State Department, the way to conceptualize your mission, you may remember many years ago when Britain was confronted with a dilemma about what to do in the Falklands, and many at the time in 1981-82 said, we don't have the wherewithal, we have to let this stand. And then Prime Minister Thatcher said, no, we must summon all of our native cunning to figure out how to respond to that. I always thought about that's what the State Department is really about. We have to summon our native cunning in any set of circumstances, bureaucratically or strategically, to make sure that we have a role in shaping events going forward. Now, despite all of the discussion about the terminology over the last several years, rebalance or pivot, I was one of the people who had originally used the terminology pivot. I was then sent to re-education camps, and I wore a red scarf and I dug with hose, but I still use the term occasionally now. But the rationale behind it, of course, was this recognition that the United States is going to have to do more to be a successful Asian Pacific player. Now, there was I think, rather unfortunate back and forth at one period of time in which one particular group of people articulated, look, we're back in Asia, and then another group would say, no, we never left. And that's what passes for sort of elevated strategic discourse around Asia, when in fact both of those are really quite profoundly wrong. To show that we are actually back in Asia will take a much longer period of time. And those who say, look, we have never left in Asia, they do not recognize that the price of entry strategically, the price to be effective in Asia, has gone up so dramatically in the last several years. It's no longer possible to phone it in. It takes a much more elevated degree of commitment, both at the presidential level, but then on down, an integrated approach inside the U.S. government to be effective. And it's not going to take one administration, but several. And that really, to be effective, has to be over the course of both Republican and Democratic administrations going forward. Now, the good thing is there is at least a degree of bipartisanship with respect to Asia, and the hope will be that some of that will continue, even though we're entering a period of rather difficult and deep partisan divides. So the Asian environment that I think we are confronting currently, in many respects, is without precedent, and it demands much more from the United States than we've ever had to give in the past. And even though there is hope, I think, in Asia about the American economy, and how many times have we all, been subjected to discussions about American decline and how we no longer have what it takes to be effective? We saw that at the end of the Cold War, at the end of the Vietnam War. Now, of course, after several years of real anxiety about American economic performance, there is a dawning understanding and recognition that those who have bet against the United States historically are going to lose a lot of money, right? And that ultimately we, if we play our cards right, will be a dominant player in the Asia-Pacific region for decades to come, at a time that there are growing concerns about not only China's economic model, but frankly the economic performance of a number of countries in Asia. What we are seeing are roiled politics, both in Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, that in many respects defy early experiences and easy remedies. I think we need to recognize that there are a number of issues that we are facing, particularly in the territorial realm, that really defy solution. And that the best we can do in the current environment is export some of those problems into the future and hopefully establish a degree of understanding that status quo, or at least modest adjustments in the status quo, are in the best interests of all involved. However, I think it'd be fair to say not only have we been unsuccessful in basically persuading Chinese friends that this is the right approach in the South China Sea and elsewhere, we haven't had very much success with other countries in that context as well, with many countries seeking to secure their positioning on distant rocky atolls across the South China Sea and the East Sea more generally. Politics and relations between Japan and China have never been worse, matched only perhaps by the relationship at a political level between Japan and South Korea. I would hope that this year, the 70th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, would provide us the context for some discussions about the remarkable achievements of the last 70 years. I think that's going to be difficult, and I think we're going to find ourselves in a set of circumstances where old issues will continue to dominate discourse between Beijing, Seoul, and directly Tokyo. And how the United States plays in that arena over the course of the next several months, in many respects, will give us a sense of the effectiveness of American foreign policy. Essentially, we have over the course of the next 6 to 8 months the visit of no less than 8 Asian heads of states to the United States. Just remarkable potential, beginning with the upcoming visit of the new president of Indonesia and essentially concluding with President Xi's visit to Washington later this year. The security dynamic is such that basically if you look at the spending habits of all the major countries in the Asia-Pacific region, you have a sudden and rather dramatic increase in capabilities and investments over the course of the last 2 or 3 years, and that's going to continue at least for the next decade. And what is happening is that monies that have traditionally gone to land forces and armies are increasingly going for expeditionary capabilities and investments. Basically, all of our major allies have essentially decided that they're going to opt in for the next largest ticket item probably in history, the F-35. Many countries are also embarking upon maritime capabilities that will allow for effective patrol of disputed maritime domain arenas. You see in Southeast Asia greater discord and disagreement about how to manage complex issues of diplomacy in multilateral discussions like the ASEAN Regional Forum and the East Asia Summit, with members of the so-called the maritime domain in ASEAN essentially expressing deep concern that this process of trying to have a code of conduct with China about activities is just not bearing fruit. And so what we're seeing essentially across Asia is an increase in military expenditures. Now, if you asked countries quietly what is driving this dynamic, almost uniformly they would say dramatic, unprecedented increases in military budgets and investments on the part of China, and investments and capabilities that directly involve the maritime neighborhood more than anything else. And you'll be talking about that over the course of the next several hours here, I'm sure. But at the same time that we are seeing this rather muscular assertion of Chinese power, both militarily but increasingly diplomatically. One of the things that's absolutely clear, if you've had any time with President Xi or his interlocutors, a much more unapologetic and clear set of statements about maritime security issues, very hard-headed approaches to a number of security dynamics, and unabashed basically designations of areas where China hopes to achieve clear military and strategic advantages over time. And that has changed very rapidly, and something that, frankly, I think is well understood in the security community, probably not as well understood and appreciated in the diplomatic community. And that's one of the reasons why these interchanges and discussions are so important between communities more generally. We have seen with China's decision to go dramatically towards an investment bank that China has essentially effectively split the coalition of countries that sort of have concerns about Bretton Woods related institutions and approaches to investment and infrastructure. Many countries basically trying to figure out how to participate in this remarkable sum of money, even if they are concerned about what it does to other lending and investment vehicles that have much more well-established procedures and the like. We have seen unprecedented diplomatic engagement by President Xi in recent months. I will tell you, one of the things that is striking to me, at least, is having spent quite a bit of time with him, the comparison and the contrast with the previous leadership. When you spent time with President Hu and Premier Wen, it was quite apparent that these were elderly men. These were men that were oftentimes had to be kind of helped into positions to sit down and to be, settled. President Xi, when you travel with him, he's often the last person to leave the bar. He's extraordinarily comfortable, engaging, comfortable in his own skin, quite strong in terms of these sort of personal interactions. I had one set of interactions with him that I found interesting at the time. We took him around the United States when he was visiting as vice president, when he had the opportunity to interact with Vice President Biden. And in those conversations, we obviously took him to Iowa, where he was a student for a short period of time. And in one of those periods where we were down in the bar discussing, this was before the fall of Bo Xilai, he talked very admiringly about how the role of propaganda from images and visuals and storylines from the 1940s and early 1950s had the potential to have an enormous psychological impact, sociological impact on a new generation of younger Chinese people, and that this sort of tremendous propaganda had to be channeled at a national level. And so you could see at the same time there was some competition and anxiety about Bo, but also a recognition that this, from his perspective, this sort of attempt to rebuild the idea of communism was deeply attractive. And I watched my Chinese colleagues around him nodding furiously, all the while thinking, this is the last communist in China. This is the guy who really believes fundamentally that this set of sort of black and white pictures from the 1940s has resonance for a very different group of Chinese urban dwellers that are making their way into the 21st century. So I see an environment that, despite some improvements, at least in the top level of U.S.-China relations. I think I've been impressed. One of the things that's happened at the strategic level is rather than focusing simply on sort of the nameplate, whether it's new great power relationships or whatever, I think those endeavors can often be can disguise other problems and, frankly, divert us from things that are much more important. What's much more critical at this endeavor is that in areas where we can actually work together, that we build some habits of cooperation. I was struck when I was in government how difficult it is to get any form of cooperation with China in any area whatsoever, whether that's humanitarian support, any issues associated with crisis prevention, the military maritime agreements, all the things that we've tried to establish that would create procedures whereby the United States and China could either head off, prevent, or divert a crisis. Those efforts, until very recently, have been paled in comparison to other challenges that we face. So more recently, you've seen some dialogue at the strategic level around climate change, around HADR, around mill-to-mill engagement that suggests that a degree of working to develop cooperation is underway between the United States and China. But at the same time, I think a fairly clear recognition on both sides about the profound limits of what's possible. Now, we have a tendency in U.S.-China relations to talk about a relationship that has elements of cooperation and elements of competition, sometimes fierce competition. I think it's undeniably the case that those areas of cooperation are much more limited in the current environment. And the areas that we are struggling on, cybersecurity, on maritime security issues, are quite profound and deep. The irony is one of the few areas that we've had a degree of, I wouldn't say it is a success of U.S.-China diplomacy, but an arena in which the two countries can take some comfort is around the issue of the Taiwan Strait, in which the unofficial relationship between the United States and Taiwan in the last several years has actually grown rather considerably at a time that U.S.-China relations at least have not veered into crisis, and undoubtedly Taiwan-China relations have improved dramatically. And so the truth is, I think Chinese leaders and diplomats take some comfort in the manner in which, fraught with huge problems and disagreements over time, the United States and China have either directly or subtly interacted on issues around the maintenance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait and the improvement of economic relations between China and Taiwan. So what does that mean? So obviously a person like me speaking to this group, so what does it mean for strategy going forward? Now, we are on the verge of an election that I think undeniably is going to focus much more about foreign policy and national security than many would have anticipated just a couple of months ago. But what is interesting, if you look at the national debate and if you look at the people around the candidates generally, most of them are Middle East specialists, and most of the discussions are around how to deal with ISIS, what to do with Iran, how to manage the South Asian issues in Afghanistan and Iraq. There is still remarkably little debate or discussion around Asia. Now, I can't figure out whether that is a good or bad thing, because frankly, too much debate that descends our body politic into deep division, I don't believe is in our best strategic interest. And in fact, I think the dirty little secret is that around most issues, there are essential agreements between Democrats and Republicans, and some of the most interesting divisions are not between the two parties but within them. And how that plays out over time is going to be fascinating. I will just say that I think we're probably entering a period that we do not fully recognize as we look at it from 20,000 feet. Essentially, the foreign policy, national security consensus of the United States since the Vietnam War was a group of internationalist Democrats. Remember, the Democratic Party since the Vietnam War has been fundamentally divided, right? With one group quite suspicious about the use of military power, about trade and the like, but the internationalist dimension of the Democratic Party has sided with essentially the totality of the Republican Party. And together, we have unevenly and uneasily promoted concepts of free trade, strong defense, forward deployed engagement generally. But what has happened in the last several years, and we tend to dismiss this as crazies or kind of fringe groups, when in fact it is a return in many respects to a much more fundamental tradition in American foreign policy and national security. And that is a group in the Republican Party that is much more suspicious about strategic engagement and military spending, and much more focused on other things, either domestically. And so you've got an unusual alignment between the left of the Democratic Party and the right of the Republican Party that has huge concerns about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, big worries about big data and the role of the individual, and a lot of personal liberty issues. And so those issues are likely to play out in a much more fundamental way over time in our foreign policy and national security. And I believe those divisions tend to be exacerbated by really some of the most difficult choices in the world in the Middle East and South Asia. When we rolled out the idea of the pivot or the rebalance, and I will just simply say, any of you who have been in government understand when you come up with an idea and you roll it out, 99 times out of 100, when you do that, it immediately disappears, right? And you try to point it to people and they're like, I don't know what you're talking about. On that very rare occasion when you roll something out and it turns out to be bigger than you anticipate, then you have to deal immediately with the unintended consequences. And for me and for us, when we rolled out this idea, the unintended consequence was the message somehow that we had to cut and run from the Middle East. Nothing could be more antithetical to America's strategic interests than doing that. And that somehow we had to pivot away from Europe, when in fact, everything that the United States has ever done of significance in the world we have done with Europe. And I expect that the same thing will be true with respect to Asia. The area that we need to expand and deepen our engagement with Europe is about Asia. And too often we let urgencies of Iran or other issues drive out these longer term interests. And trust me, the region that's pivoting more rapidly to Asia than the United States is Europe. So understanding that and recognizing that is going to be very important. So I would simply say that these debates are likely to play out subtly in ways that to the uninitiated is not completely understood. So I would say that there are fundamentally two schools of thoughts when it comes to constructing and developing a strategy with respect to the Asia-Pacific region. And what's interesting about these schools is that they permeate or they divide parties. They are not united in one party or the other. The first school of thought essentially has argued traditionally, not always transparently, but clearly, that at the core of American strategy is getting China right. And then if you get China right, then everything tends to follow from that. And that's, our allies and other countries in the region as a whole. And there is something about that approach that is deeply romantic and mysterious and Kissingerian, a lot of secret diplomacy, a lot of White House-led secret missions. It's all very sexy, right? And that approach has permeated White Houses traditionally, much more prevalent in Republican administrations than Democrat, but still on both sides quite there. Republican, Wall Street, deep engagement, an attempt in many respects to recreate sort of this mystery of the original opening in the late 1970s and early 1980s. I find myself often in the audience of the true creators, the architects of the original relationship with China, and often they look down on those of us who practice in the current environment. We're looked downable, I understand that. But at the same time, I have to say that the strategies that you employ when you're trying to lure a country out of self-imposed isolation 30 or 40 years ago, and the strategies that you employ today when you're trying to shape the decisions of the most rapidly rising and now uncertain state on the global stage, it's just night and day. And so you have to expect at a fundamental level that there is going to be substantial sand in the gears of U.S.-China relations. And if there is not tension in the U.S.-China relation on a relatively regular basis, it means someone is not doing their job, right? So that is the one school. I think the problem increasingly with that school is that it tends to mimic certain aspects of tributary diplomacy, makes other countries feel anxious in the region, and I don't think it serves at a strategic level American interests in Asia as a whole. The second school is much less prominent, but very well represented throughout the bureaucracy. And that's the idea that if you manage your alliances well with Japan, with Australia, with Korea, then you're better able to deal with big problems like the rise of China or instability across the Taiwan Straits. People associated with this school are people like Joe Nye or Rich Armitage. They tend to be workman-like stuff at the Pentagon, right? But unlike, you know, the big kind of long-term trends that you get to talk about in U.S.-China relations, you're talking about where the palm trees go on Okinawa, right? So you're talking about really hard, detailed, alliance-oriented stuff, and it's not sexy, but it is absolutely essential. And at the base of it is a recognition that the basing of your forces on another country's soil is an unnatural act and creates tension and requires constant work, right? So essentially these two schools, they roughly coexist. They share many overarching goals and ambitions. They're like two concentric circles. But I think I would argue that both of them now are inadequate in terms of how the United States has to conceptualize its way forward. And I'm just going to conclude quickly, Glenn, with just a few things that I think have to be essential in American strategy going forward. First and foremost is I think still, despite discussions about whether our alliance structure should devolve to something in history, I think that's absolutely incorrect. I think our alliance structure has never been more relevant, and that means working very hard to update guidelines, work with Japan on its dramatic renovations on the security side, trying harder to bring South Korea and Japan together, Australia pulling more unofficial engagement with Singapore, with Taiwan. These military strategic engagements, quasi-engagements, are incredibly important, and they are at the foundation of what the United States does in Asia. Second is a recognition that high-level commitment to purposeful diplomacy is what the region expects. Every country, despite its anxieties, wants a better relationship with China. It is essential that we focus our attention on trying to build that relationship, understanding the difficulties, working hard on transparency, on confidence building, on building habits of cooperation, and finding areas where we can work together, but also calling China out in areas like cybersecurity, where their activities are deeply antithetical to the maintenance of good public order in the maritime and otherwise domain. So I think the U.S.-China relationship has to be a central feature of engagement in Asia, and that is what the region expects. They don't want too hot or too cold. They want a purposeful, constant, consistent engagement. But I must say, we have a tendency to, bend over backwards. We do fantastic retreats with, sunny lands and lots of bells and whistles, huge fruit bowls, things like that when they come to visit. We need to do more of that for our Asian allies and friends, recognizing that face matters, particularly among democratic states in Asia. So we have a tendency to really bend over and do a lot for Chinese friends. I'm not saying we should not do that, but we should do it more generally for friends in Japan and South Korea and elsewhere going forward. Third, I think to the extent that there really is a pivot or rebalance, much of it has to be from Northeast Asia to Southeast Asia. The region that increasingly will be sort of the pivot in multilateral diplomacy, and increasingly with respect to our strategic engagements will be in Southeast Asia. And so we need to engage the region not only at the ASEAN level, but direct countries within it. If you had to make a list of the most important countries in the world that the United States doesn't even acknowledge and understand, Indonesia would be near the top of that list. So developing much deeper relations with Indonesia, Vietnam, hopefully really overcoming some of the current problems that we face so that we could forge a much closer military and strategic set of engagements with Vietnam, and recognizing the proud, remarkable achievements of the Philippine people and seeking to rebuild that relationship from a nadir that existed for years after the closure of our bases. Right? So Southeast Asia is going to be essential. We've got to invest the time and attention understanding more about the ASEAN way and making clear that a unified, engaged ASEAN on maritime security issues matters, and that at the heart of real institutional building in Asia really is ASEAN. Fourth, everyone in Asia understands that our ticket to the big game is the military dimension. However, Asia has basically decided, which I agree with, that American seriousness will be judged on one issue over the course of the next few years, and that's the issue associated with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. If we did everything right in Asia, showed up, ate the food the right way, did all the things that we struggle to do as Americans, and not get TPP, we can't get a passing grade. We can do everything wrong, cancel meetings, insult inadvertently leaders, and get TP, and we have a B. That's how important it is. That's how essential this will be, building some sort of domestic consensus in the United States that allows us to get this over the finish line will be essential. My hat goes off to Mike Froman and my colleagues. I think we've left it to very late. We'll see. Every trade agreement goes through the deepest, darkest tunnel. We are in that tunnel now. We'll see what takes place, but frankly, failure is so difficult, it's hard for me to even assess the idea of backing away from it. But it will not be possible to stop there. We have to have a round two. We have to start discussing with countries who are interested what the requirements would be, what they need to think about in terms of push-ups and pull-ups to get ready for the test, right? And that's going to be important as we go forward, and essentially making clear to countries that aspire that there is a role for them in some high-level, high-quality agreement over time. The defense side, of which you all will discuss over the course of the next several hours, is obviously at the core of what you're thinking about. Our biggest challenge, to be honest, in Asia is really not the budget issues, which is what people focus on the most. Budget issues are enormously challenging, I would grant that. The real issue is inflexibility associated with various approaches, difficulty associated with how we reposition our forces. Our forces stationed in Northeast Asia face enormous particular challenges from vulnerabilities, but they also face challenges from our inability to diversify. Thank God last year the Senate Armed Services Committee allowed finally for developments to take place in Guam, but over time we must diversify more of our forces from Northeast Asia, that's our Marines, that's others, to Southeast Asia. Much deeper engagements in the Philippines. We must create operational concepts that link the Indian with the Pacific Oceans, and we must bring in partners elsewhere to work together on shared challenges like HADR and the like. I know there'll probably be groups in this audience that would say there's no such thing as climate change. I'll leave you to that. But most of the studies suggest that with the substantial increase in surface temperature of the Pacific, that the severity of storms over the next 10 to 20 years will go up dramatically. We have to be prepared for that. When you have an emergency, who you call the United States. The United States has to begin to organize, work more effectively within the context of military institutions to respond more generally. Last two things. bring other friends into the conversations on Asia and coordinating that. India lives in a difficult neighborhood. We want India's look east diplomacy to be successful. One of the areas where the United States and India have had the greatest impact in terms of our ability to work together is a shared desire of India to play a role in the Asia-Pacific region. We should support that both in institutions, military, and the like. It's also the case that Europe has a lot to bring to the table with respect to Asia, not least of which is how to build institutions. We need to work and coordinate much more closely with European friends and get them to adopt a much more comprehensive strategy as a whole and not just focused on one or two countries in the region as a whole. So what I've tried to lay out, Glenn, for the audience here is that in the midst of this dramatic worsening and complicated security environment, the United States has to respond with a much more comprehensive approach. We must elevate it within the context of our own foreign policy and national security. And I acknowledge how difficult that will be. Probably for the last 15 years, the lion's share of the attention of our senior-most officials is spent on where American forces are deployed and the conflicts that we are involved in on an urgent daily basis. But we have to recognize that if we do not shift our attention subtly and then ultimately directly more towards the Asia-Pacific region, our position will erode over time. I can't think of anything that is more contrary to American strategic interests. Glenn, I'll stop there. I'd be happy to take any particular questions. I recognize this is not directly up your alley, but I want you to know that how you think about these strategic military issues drives how, hopefully, people think about larger strategy over time.